Long ago, a philosopher once put forth a theory that human nature was evil, as humans were born evil. This wasn't a cynical standpoint, but postulating that humans needed to continually improve themselves, restraining their inherent evil. Carter strongly agreed with this standpoint. Just like the evil of voyeurism that was in his bones, good upbringing allowed him to have a good moral sense. So he didn't just muddle through the lesson. When teaching the prisoners, he genuinely hoped that his words would get through to them. After that episode, the thug did sit up and look at the whiteboard in earnest. The fraudster was greatly intimidated by the baton and listened with rapt attention, cooperatively nodding every now and then. As for Melvin, seated furthest away, not only did he not flip through his book, his eyes were even closed as he listened. What's up with this guy? Does he think he's here to take an afternoon nap? Perhaps because Carter was in his element, he gradually broke away from the shadow of his voyeurism, reaching true composure in his mind. 1017, he called out Melvin's number again. The contents that I'm teaching today will be tested tomorrow. The scores will affect your prison performance grade. You'd best listen well. I'm listening. Melvin lifted an eyelid. There wasn't any cloudiness in his gaze, like he was simply resting his eyes earlier. Are you sure? Carter asked. Then what did I just say? Don't form cliques, don't oppress others, said Melvin. His answer was word for word, as if he had carefully taken all of it in. But that was content that Carter had only just covered. It was normal to have some impression of it. And before that? Carter persisted. You're Carter. Without even taking any time to think, Melvin gave this answer. Carter blanked for a split second, only after recovering then realized that that was the very first thing he had said to Melvin after entering the meeting room. Which also meant to say that he got Melvin to recount what he had earlier said, and Melvin directly cycled all the way back, returning straight to the starting point. His thought processes really leapt quite far. Carter's momentary stupefaction caused the topic to jam here. He simply chose to drop it, going back to talk of the key points in the rulebook. Half an hour later, Carter finished covering to the last page. He looked at the three men and asked, "Do you have any questions for me?" The thug raised his hand, asking, "Is the test open book or closed book?" "Closed," Carter said. "Then if caught cheating—" "Solitary confinement," Carter interrupted the thug impatiently. "Next question." "Sir," the fraudster raised his hand. "When will we receive our labor allocations?" Carter glanced at Melvin. Seeing that he didn't seem to have anything he wanted to ask, Carter flipped the whiteboard over to the other side, pointing to a basic schematic diagram on it. "Next, I'll explain to you how things work in Southside Prison." Southside Prison had a total of 3 cell blocks and over 200 inmates. Newly incarcerated convicts would stay in Block C for a period of time first to acclimatize to the environment. Then, based on their performance, they would be assigned to either Block A or B. Block B was the regular block with multiple inmates to a cell, whereas Block A had confinement cells and single cells, holding the most dangerous inmates. "The guy who brought you over is Block C's supervisor," Carter said. "For the next period of time, you will mainly be reporting to him." "Is he easy to get along with?" the thug asked. "That depends on your performance," said Carter. All inmates needed to do labor. 2 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon, with 2 hours of free time in between for them to rest. At night, there would be time for them to watch the news or other such group activities. "What labor activities are there?" the thug cut into Carter again. "Painting, woodworking, sewing, gardening, and so on," Carter tempered himself to answer. "Which is the easiest?" the thug continued to ask. This time, Carter's gaze turned completely cold as he looked impassively at the thug. He could show patience when interacting with the community workers, but to such unremorseful convicts he never had much of a temper. The thug awkwardly scratched his nose, likely understanding what Carter was saying with his eyes, and stopped asking useless questions. "The building you're in now is the admin block. Aside from meeting rooms, there is also an auditorium on the ground floor. The library and infirmary are on the second floor, and the office area for prison staff is on the 3rd floor. The admin block and the 3 cell blocks were all 3-storied buildings. There was also a corridor on the 2nd floor connecting the buildings together. Carter concisely explained how Southside Prison worked and the daily schedule of the inmates, then routinely asked, "Any more questions?" The fraudster and the thug didn't utter a word, as though able to tell that Carter was close to the end of his fuse. Seeing that there were none, Carter picked up the slim book, ready to end this class. But just then, after having stayed silent for a long time, Melvin suddenly jerked his chin up, speaking to Carter. "Is there surveillance installed everywhere?" Slightly perplexed, Carter's eyebrows knit, and his mind involuntarily started to guess what Melvin was angling at with this question. No questions popped up from nowhere. For example, the thug asking about the consequences of cheating exposed his thoughts of cheating, and his asking which menial labor was the easiest exposed his preference for easier labor. However, what Carter couldn't understand was why the prison surveillance mattered to Melvin. Could it be that he was thinking of breaking out? It was rather unlikely. He only had a 1-year sentence. If he behaved well, there might even be an opportunity for him to reduce his sentence. He shouldn't need to take the risk of escaping prison. But apart from this, Carter really couldn't think of another reason. He disliked this feeling of groping in the dark, yet this neighbor who lived across the street always seemed to be this way, arousing his burning curiosity at the drop of a hat. He swiftly collected his jumbled thoughts, giving Melvin a not quite accurate answer. Completing Carter's words, the accurate answer should be, of course not. Over the next few days, Melvin would find that the showers and the toilets didn't have security monitoring, and in a little while more he would find that even for places with surveillance installed, there existed blind spots and broken cameras. This wasn't any confidential secret. The reason that improvements were not made was that there were guards everywhere in the prison as well as a patrol team standing by 24/7. As such, it wasn't as necessary to have video surveillance. Southside Prison's guards seldom relied on surveillance, but Carter was the only one with a secret unknown to anyone. The library was located in a corner of the 2nd floor. Further inside, there was a storeroom appropriated by inmates. The room used to store mops, pushcarts, and other cleaning agents. But from an unknown point in time, the inmates on cleaning duty had moved these items elsewhere, leaving only 2 cabinets and emptying out the rest of the room. During the harsh winters and the hot summers, some inmates were reluctant to shiver in the wind or melt under the sun. Also unwilling to read books in the library, they would go to chat in the storeroom. Later on, picnic mats were spread across the ground. Some inmates brought in snacks, thoroughly transforming this place into a recreation room for inmates to relax. When Carter first started working at Southside Prison, he had reported this problem to the warden. The lack of monitoring installed in the recreation room had essentially turned it into a haven for the inmates. However, this recreation room had already existed for several years without anything serious arising from it. The warden didn't want to sow dissent among the inmates, thus didn't bother taking action on Carter's report. So Carter privately bought a pinhole camera and installed it in the recreation room for the sole purpose of catching inmates breaking prison rules. While he did catch several people smoking inside, this minor infraction wasn't sufficient to warrant action against this recreation room. Over time, Carter eventually let go of his nosiness, but the pinhole camera remained in the recreation room. Every time he wanted to blow off steam, he would turn on his computer and watch what inmates in the recreation room were doing. This could be said to be voyeurism. It could also be said to be surveillance. Carter wouldn't feel any guilt over it. Those people were convicts anyway. It wasn't as if it was his neighbor. Oh right, his neighbor was now a convict too. Returning from the small meeting room to his work area in the library, Carter collapsed into the office chair, rubbing his temples with a headache. The pent-up shock that he had earlier received now burst forth all at once. Mr. Zack in an immaculate suit and Mr. Zack in the prison uniform flickered back and forth in his mind over and over again, causing him to be unable to tell for a moment who his neighbor really was. Why would a good man commit a crime? Carter abruptly sat up straight and picked up the dossier he had tossed onto the table, flipping to the file containing Melvin's information. The height and weight were rather close to what he had predicted, but under the education section, the words "high school diploma" were written in plain sight. This was largely incongruent with what Carter had guessed, for he had always assumed that Melvin was a social elite or at the very least had a master's degree from one of those prestigious overseas universities. Why? Your ideal type? Luke's voice suddenly came from overhead, disrupting Carter's thoughts. He let go of the paper in his hand, glancing leisurely at Luke, saying, "You're insulting me." Carter, who said this, had conveniently forgotten that at least up to today, he had been using Melvin as the object of his fantasies for the better part of a year. Luke casually leaned on the perimeter set by the office desk, arms crossed in front of his chest, teasing, "Isn't that your ideal type? He's tall and handsome, just like me." Carter picked up the dossier and slapped Luke's back with it. "Get lost." Actually, Luke wasn't lying. After all, he was Carter's ex-boyfriend, who worked as a doctor in the infirmary opposite the library. The two were introduced by a mutual friend but broke it off peacefully after 2 years together. It wasn't really a problem with either of them, merely that their personalities weren't very compatible. The breakup was initiated by Carter, who found that he and Luke got along more like friends, lacking any of the passion that should be present between romantic partners. More importantly, it was impossible for him to share his secret of voyeurism with Luke, but what he wanted was an open and honest relationship. Luke readily agreed to the breakup when James Chidging proposed it. According to him, he also felt that they were better off as friends. After breaking up, they still kept in contact. It was precisely due to Luke working in the prison that sparked the idea in Carter that there could actually be a job perfectly suited to his hobby. Putting down the dossier, Carter leaned back into his office chair and continued the earlier topic, sighing deeply. That man is a con. If before Carter still held unease in his frame of mind towards Melvin, then by now this unease would have vanished without a trace left behind. A convict was, in the end, a convict. No matter how attractive he looked, Carter wouldn't budge an inch. Yeah. The joking expression faded from Luke's face, and he sighed shortly after. He caused several broken families and deaths. Were there many? Carter didn't follow the case too closely and didn't understand the concrete details of it. Just his most recent stunt alone caused at least 2 people to jump off a building, Luke said. Carter was long aware that playing with stocks came with its risks, so he never dabbled in it. But there were too many gamblers in the world who, even at the risk of losing their family fortune, wanted to gamble their future in the stock market. Many people in prison are probably disgruntled with him, Carter said objectively. A national-scale case like this would similarly also come to the attention of the inmates in prison. Since Melvin's actions had sparked public outrage, there would certainly be inmates eager to right wrongs in accordance with heaven's will. Oh, for sure. Luke pushed up his glasses with his middle finger. Shall we bet on how long it'll take for someone to mess him up? A week, Carter said. I'm betting 3 days, Luke said. Carter more or less had a gauge of the power in Melvin's strikes and felt that this guy would probably know how to protect himself. 3 days was really quite far-fetched. Full of confidence, he said, "A dinner at a Michelin restaurant." You're on. Coming to this point, Luke appeared to suddenly think of something, changing the subject. By the way, are you really not going to the blind date that I introduced to you before? Carter moved his gaze away listlessly, indifferent as he said, "Not going." Don't blame me for not reminding you. Luke patted Carter's shoulder like an elder wise beyond his years. You're going to end up forever alone if you go on like this, bro. Do you have any right to lecture me? Carter batted Luke's hand away. Have you resolved your own singledom? That's not the same, Luke said. I've got a prospective partner, and you. I don't need one. Carter really didn't need someone to date. He only needed someone to voyeur on, and his spiritual needs would be fulfilled. However, now the only guy he had been secretly spying on, forget it. The more he thought about it, the stuffier his heart felt. On the way home from work, Carter came across a middle-aged woman carrying 2 cartons of milk in front of a small supermarket outside the community. The woman was Auntie Lou, who lived behind Carter's house and would occasionally give homemade snacks to her neighbors on the weekends. She was a nice person to be around. Seeing that Auntie Lou was struggling with her groceries, he slowed the car and pulled up beside her, lowering the window. Hop on, Auntie Lou, I'll give you a lift back. Auntie Lou's sweaty brows unfurrowed, and she breathed a sigh of relief. If I may trouble you then, little James. Carter had no way of changing his old habits. He and Auntie Lou were only casual acquaintances, but over the course of their interactions, he habitually analyzed Auntie Lou's general situation. Auntie Lou shouldn't have any men living with her, else she wouldn't have to carry milk home like this herself. She should have children, but they weren't around, which was why she liked to interact with the young people in the community. Carter had always been a keen judge of people. Later, as they talked, he learned that not a single guest had missed the mark. Speaking of which, the only person he was completely out of his depth about was Melvin. At 9 in the morning, while other inmates were still at their morning classes, the 3 new inmates over here had already handed in their test scripts. The paper was 100 marks in total and consisted of 30 multiple-choice questions and 1 short answer question. Regardless of how well they answered the MCQs, as long as they showed a serious attitude when answering the last sock, Carter would give them decent scores. The test scripts of the fraudster and the thug were normal, with at least 100 words in their last question. However, when Melvin handed in his test script, Carter immediately called hold of him. "This is your test script?" Melvin stopped in his tracks and turned his head over to look at Carter, saying, "Yeah." "Why didn't you answer the sock?" Carter asked. "Don't know." After flippantly tossing down this statement, Melvin pushed open the meeting room door and left, following behind a prison guard. Frankly, this short answer question was very simple. All they had to do was pen a paragraph showing remorse for their crime, and Carter would give them good scores. Of all the new inmates that he had instructed, this was the first time that Carter saw one who did not write a word. No, to be accurate, Melvin did write 1 word. Under the question, he wrote the word, "answer." Carter never had much expectation for inmates to have good handwriting. But someone like Melvin who could even make his own name look ugly was rarely seen. It really was a waste of such an attractive face. Carter believed that one's handwriting was revealing of character. If Melvin's appearance gave him plus points in Carter's books, then his handwriting subtracted an equivalent amount of points. When he finished scoring the script, Melvin had a total score of 1 mark. It needed to be said that each MCQ was worth 2 marks. Even if he had gone by blind guessing, it was impossible to get every single question wrong. But Melvin had perfectly avoided all the correct answers, only earning a grudging 1 mark from Carter based on that single answer at the end. Truth be told, Carter didn't even want to award him that 1 mark at all. He had always assumed that the financial market required a certain threshold of intelligence before one could muck around in the industry, let alone cause a financial crime case able to shake the roots of the nation. By right, the convict should be quite intelligent. But now, Carter only had one thought in his head: committing a crime with this level of IQ. It was no wonder that he got caught.